in relation primarily to the brood nest. In the opening this morning, they mentioned some individuals that got bees last year, set them out in the backyard, and never looked at them because they were scared they were going to kill bees, or they were scared that they would do something wrong or not know what they were doing, or they were possibly even scared of being stung. Back when I first got started in beekeeping, probably been about 40 years ago, we had what we called bee havers. You would set a colony out behind the garage in the spring, and in the fall you would go out and harvest a crop of honey. But since then, there have been many new problems: tracheal mites, varroa mites, small eye beetles, etc., and it's no longer possible for you to be a bee haver. Now you have to be a bee manager. And to manage bees, you have to, one, understand their basic biology, and secondly, you have to be willing to go into the hive and just check on what's going on, what needs to be done, what you need to do as a basic manager. Next slide, please. Are you one of those individuals who never go below the queen excluder? If you use queen excluders and look in the brood nest, you should not just assume that everything is going to be A-OK. There are numerous problems that can develop. So what we're going to be concentrating on today is managing the brood nest. This is where the first signs of trouble will often occur. And so you have to know what you're doing, what you're looking at, and then make the decisions whether the colony is performing as it should be or whether you need to do something. Within the brood nest, within the hive itself, combs are the basic structural units of the colony. And here we see a comb that's been removed out of the brood nest. You see a patch of brood in the center, surrounded by the band of pollen. Just for orientation's sake, this comb that you're looking at is upside down. In other words, the top bars of the comb would be here next to you. So you'd be holding the top bars and looking at the comb in front of you. So ideally, if it was just hanging horizontally in the hive, what we would expect to find is a patch of brood surrounded on the upper half by a band of pollen, and then honey above that. So brood, pollen, and honey, and we'll talk more about that later. Even feral colonies that are in a bee tree, as you see here, combs are the basic structural unit of that hive. They're shaped differently, but they're still used for the same purposes in the basic biology of the hive. What are the basic functions of a comb? First of all is reproduction of the colony. That's where the eggs are laid, that's where the larvae hatch from the eggs, they're cared for, then they go into the resting stage, the pupal stage, and then the new adult chews her way out. The comb is also used for the storage of nectar and pollen. Later today I'm going to be talking about bee nutrition. I'm talking about the basic diet of a bee. And two of the basic components of that diet will be nectar, the raw product of honey, and pollen. And together, that forms a complete balanced diet. The comb in the colony is also the foundation for establishing a winter cluster. Honeybees are unique from the standpoint that they remain active around the year, or throughout the year. Most insects survive the winters by either hibernating, or in the case of the monarch butterfly, migrating south. But the honeybees remain active regardless of what the temperature is outside of the hive by forming what we call a winter cluster. And so that is their basic survival mechanism, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Also, honeybees are well known for the communicated dances that they perform. Well, the comb hanging in the hive is the basic surface on which they do these communicated dances, and based on that, bees are provided information where a potential new home site is located or a potential new food site is located. We said reproduction is one of the first components of the hive. Down here at the very bottom, on your left, you see a tiny white egg. We'll show you other pictures of eggs as we go. That egg in 3 days hatches into a young larvae. You see the C-shaped larvae in the bottom of the cell as you move up on the left side. And then you see the long, grub-like structure. That's the prepupa. And then they begin to take the form of the adult bees, and we call those the various stages of the pupal stage. And so you need to be able to recognize the various brood stages within the hive as you see pictured here in this slide. Comb is also where they store nectar as it's collected from flowers, the raw product of honey. And it's as it's in the comb that the processing takes place to ripen that nectar into honey. And that's another whole lecture in itself. But the storage of food, both in the form of nectar as you see there and pollen as you see here, this is all stored within the empty cells of the comb. And here we see a close-up of the pollen as it's been packed in those cells to keep it from spoiling, so it'll be of value at a later time when the bees can use it. Way down here on your far left side, you see a cell that's got like 3 little pellets in it. What happens is when a worker returns to the hive with pollen on her hind legs or in her pollen baskets, she backs into a cell. She kicks the pollen pellets off. Then other house bees come along and ram it with their head and pack it into the cell as you see here. Cappings are not placed on pollen cells. They remain open like this until that pollen is used. We said the winter cluster forms on these combs. Here we see a dead colony, but you see the remnants of that winter cluster. And what I want you to think about is the winter cluster is a large sphere of bees separated by 4 or 5 combs. And the bees on the outside are the insulating shell. As the temperature drops outside, the bees get tighter and tighter together to conserve the heat energy that's being produced by the bees on the inside of that winter cluster. And as the bees on the outside get chilled, they move to the center, and warm bees in the center move to the outside. How do bees produce heat? You know what it means to shiver. All right? The muscles in their thorax shiver and generate heat. And then I say that insulating shell of bees on the outside of that sphere is what conserves that heat energy. So they do not warm the entire hive, they merely warm the area within the cluster. So it doesn't matter whether you've left 2 hive bodies on or 5 hive bodies on. From a wintering standpoint, they do not heat the entire hive. They only heat where the winter cluster is located. A closer up view of that winter cluster as we've just described it to you. We also said the combs serve as orientation points for the dances. Now there are numerous different types of dances that are used within the honeybee colony. But the two main ones are shown here. On your left is called the round dance. And a bee comes in and begins doing the round dance on the comb, and periodically stops and regurgitates a droplet of nectar to the bees that are touching her. When they're touching her with their antenna, they're actually smelling what that floral source or what that food source smells like. And basically, the round dance, it just says, within 100 yards of the hive, there's this food source. Go out and search for it. So that's 100 yards or less from the hive. On your right is what we call the waggle dance or the wagtail dance. And you notice this particular bee, it's like a figure 8. The bee is going up, and as she goes up the comb, she vibrates her abdomen. Then she turns, comes around to the bottom, vibrates again, and goes around, up again. All right, now, if she's going straight up the comb, as you see pictured here, it's telling the potential foragers to fly straight towards the sun. If she does the waggle portion down the comb, it means fly directly away from the sun. Or if she does it at an angle on the comb, then it's the angle between the sun and the angle that she's dancing on the comb. And by the number of vibrations per second of her abdomen, she is conveying to the bees that are paying attention to her how much energy has to be expended in order to get to this new food source or new home site. And so, with the waggle dance, they are telling other bees making up the society in what direction to fly and how far to fly. So both distance and direction are being shown there. Now, when you go into a brood comb, you pull out a frame, you will see a comb possibly that looks something like this. And for the beginners, it's important that you be able to recognize all the different parts on this comb. Up in the far left corner, the patch, that is capped honey. Then you go to the right of that capped honey, and you see some open cells of pollen, and then another small patch of capped honey. Below that, you see capped worker brood. And at the very bottom, you see some cells that have caps on, but they look like bullets. They're more domed, rounded. That's capped drone brood. Drones are the males. Workers are basically sterile females. And then we also have in the colony a queen, which is the fertile female that's responsible for laying eggs. And so when you pull out a comb, it's important that you be able to recognize the various components as you see here on the comb. Next slide. Most established beekeepers will tell you that one of the limiting factors in the operation is not having enough drawn comb. Let me explain what drawn comb is. Now you can buy plastic combs, you can buy plastic foundation that you put into a wooden frame, you can buy beeswax foundation that you put into a wooden frame. So you've got all these different choices. But when you put in a sheet of foundation and the bees produce wax and produce the 6-sided cells making up this comb on each side, we say that they're drawing foundation. Or we say that's a drawn comb that has the actual cells present. And when you're just starting out, then you're going to start out with 0 drawn comb. You're going to give the bees foundation, and they're going to have to draw it out. Another concern for the beginner is having the proper arrangement of combs in that hive. Now, when you're starting out brand new with brand new equipment, you're probably going to start out using the Langstroth hive or the 10-frame hive. Okay? So you may start out with 10 frames containing foundation. As the bees draw that foundation, you may get to a point where you'll take out one of the combs and you'll respace them, kind of equally space them, and that forces the bees to draw the comb out further. Okay? Now, again, this is personal preference. I personally like to use 9 frames or 9 combs in my brood chambers. I also like to use 9 combs in my honey supers because that forces the bees to draw it out further, which means it's easier then to cut the cappings off when I'm going to extract the honey from it. Now, I said when you go from 10 to 9, and you're not going to do it until they've drawn out the foundation. When you go from 10 to 9, you need to think about a concept that's called bee space. And bee space is defined as a distance between 1/4 and 3/8 of an inch. Any space in that hive that's less than 1/4, the bees are going to fill it in with a material that we call propolis. P-R-O-P-O-L-I-S. Some of you may call it bee glue. But any gap less than 1/4 of an inch, they will fill it in with propolis. They go out and collect this sappy, gummy, pitch-like material from buds and from the trunks of trees, etc. And they varnish the inside of the hive, and they fill up areas where the cracks are less than 1/4 of an inch. Any gap that's greater than 3/8 of an inch, they will build burr comb, brace comb. And it makes a mess, and I'll show you a picture here in just a minute. But if the gap is